Hello, I'm Erica Salmon Byrne, and welcome to another edition of Inside Compliance. Today in the studio I have as my guest Roy Snell from the Society for Corporate Compliance and Ethics, and Roy and I are going to be discussing a variety of things of interest to the audience, but we're going to concentrate first off on the increasing influence of the compliance officer and how the compliance officer talks to the board. Roy, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's a pleasure.
So you guys just did a really interesting study with compliance officers, SCCE members, about how they feel like their interactions with the board is going. What drove the decision to do that survey in the first place?
Well, one of the most important aspects of the compliance function is influence, and their connection with the board is very important. In fact, we actually did this survey in 2010 and repeated it last year. And we're interested in finding out about their relationship with the board, whether their relationship is filtered, do they report directly to the board, how often they meet, these sorts of things. And it's been very helpful in trying to establish how many organizations or what percentage of the organizations are following best practice.
And so in terms of best practice, one of the things that I was struck by is that many compliance officers say that they feel like they get enough time with the board, but then when you actually look at how much time they actually spend with the board, you know, there seems to be a little bit of a disconnect. Did you find the same?
Yeah, I think that the real challenge, of course, is the board's pulled in many directions. Yeah. They have so many priorities. But I think that you're absolutely right, that there probably should be a little bit more time right now. And I think we ought to be very careful about how we use that time, too. I think one of the things the board needs right now is for us to back up a little bit and help them better understand the role of the compliance officer and the function of a compliance program. So the little time we get, we've got to be very careful about how we use it.
And I would agree with that. You know, when we look at the data in our What Directors Think survey, which on the governance side of NYSE Governance Services we've been running for over 11 years now, they say they're increasingly concerned about the complexity of the regulatory environment. They say that they're not sure that they know enough about those topics. And then at the same time, as you say, they're pulled in so many different directions. And still, you know, to this day, we often see compliance reporting into the audit committee. And when you think about everything that the audit committee has on their plate, you know, it's a tremendous amount to ask of a director, just have enough time and to spend enough time to know enough about the compliance program. And yet they understand it's important. So what's your advice to a compliance officer when talking to the board?
Well, I think you've raised a couple of really interesting things. I think boards are a little nervous right now about the regulatory environment, and frankly, it's being caused by the enforcement community, who on occasion mentions that they don't think that these organizations are getting the message with the fines and penalties, and that they're going to have to start holding individuals or boards more accountable. And so they're getting a little bit nervous. And sometimes nervousness is caused by a lack of understanding. And this kind of gets back to the issue of trying to help the board understand the function of a compliance program and the role of a compliance officer. When you increase the understanding of things like this, you reduce the tension. Compliance programs and the role of the compliance officer is really not a complex concept. But somebody's got to sit down with them with a very clear message to help them understand it. As a matter of fact, right now I'm working on a small pamphlet, maybe 20 pages, a half-page pamphlet, that will be intended to give to compliance officers to help them teach the board and leadership about the function of the compliance program and the role of the compliance officer. I see all too often people describing compliance programs who don't have a lot of experience with compliance programs. And when you don't completely understand it, you think everything's important. And so it gets very complicated. I'm going to try and get a real simple message so that they can understand it in simple terms.
Right, because at the end of the day, it really does come down to risk. Right, in many ways. And most board members understand the concept of risk and how to evaluate risk. And so if you can take something that directors are very comfortable with, like a risk analysis, and correlate that over to your compliance program and show that at the end of the day what it really is risk mitigation, then that's one way of facilitating that dialogue. You know, one of the things that I find interesting when looking at the board level is the number of companies in highly regulated spaces like healthcare, which obviously the HCCA has a tremendous membership on the healthcare side, the sister organization to SCCE. There we're seeing a lot of risk and compliance committees at the board level. So
Right.
they've actually made a decision to take the compliance reporting structure away from audit and give it to a group that is a little bit more focused on the risk side of the business and compliance. Do you expect to see that trend continue and grow outside of healthcare?
Yeah, I absolutely do. And I think the reason why healthcare approaches things a little bit more differently is healthcare got started maybe not earlier than every other industry, but earlier than most
Right.
industries. And they didn't just get started in a small way. They got started in a big way.
Mm-hmm.
First part, it's a large part of the economy, so there's more of them and more compliance officers, more expertise, more networking, more advancement of best practices, but they're being fined like few other industries.
Mm-hmm.
And so they've been forced to mature with regard to the evolution of compliance programs and compliance officers faster than other industries. And so I do think you'll see those sort of best practices spread to other industries.
Speaking of industries that are getting fined, we can't let an Inside Compliance edition go by without talking about financial services. Obviously, we're seeing an explosion in the number of compliance officers being hired at the big banks. I think JP Morgan said that they hired 1,500 new compliance officers. HSBC hired 1,700 new compliance officers. These are people who are, in most cases, brand new to the space, don't necessarily know a whole lot about compliance. What's your key skill for a compliance officer? What's the one thing that you think they need to have?
Well, I think to back up a little bit, I think that a lot of the elements of a compliance program have been around for a long time. Audit, legal analysis, risk assessments, investigations, and these sorts of things. Been around a long time. And yet we still see some of the most major settlements that have occurred in the last 10 years be about issues where the company knew for 1, 2, 3, up to 10 years that the problem existed, and they didn't do anything. So the key skill for a compliance officer, in my mind, is influence. That's the thing that was missing. We had all the elements of a compliance program, but they weren't coordinated, and there wasn't an individual with a seat at the table who could convince leadership that certain action should be taken. And so in my mind, and when I look out and think about the people that I respect the most in the profession, it's those that seem to have the greatest ability to influence decision making and change and influence leadership at the C-suite and the board level.
And so by influence, you don't really necessarily mean the extent to which someone respects and listens to the compliance officer. You more mean their ability to influence change and to convince others within the organization that change is appropriate.
Right. You want to influence several things. Almost on a weekly basis, there's something that you have to convince someone to do.
Or not to.
Or not do.
Right.
Dedicate more time to education or resolve a problem that has been found, or not take a certain step that might cause a problem. Maybe influence the size of the budget. There's a number of things that they have to influence throughout the course of the year, including, as you mentioned, kind of getting leadership to send the right message to the rest of the organization.
Right. I was particularly struck by Robert Kuzami's line several months ago now that he was coining what he called the Justin Bieber rule of compliance, that there are some things that just aren't worth it. But that goes to this influence point, which is basically that one of the things the compliance officer may have to do is influence someone in the business not to do something,
Right.
and not necessarily to make the wrong choice, but to look at a particular joint venture partner, to look at a third-party agent, to look at a new line of business, to look at some course of action and say, you know what, that risk's not worth it.
Yeah, it's sometimes it's painting a picture of down the road or in the future, what if. And the classic example is trying to help people imagine what if this goes a certain way, and what would it look like as a headline in the newspaper?
Right.
And so if they can help leadership kind of get a feel for how this decision they're about to make will be perceived by the public, they can help them avoid, there's fines and penalties, and some go to jail. But there's also the bad press that goes along with certain decisions. And that's where the real artful compliance professional who can influence leadership can help them maybe see that before it happens.
Right. No, I think you're absolutely right. It's that persuasive skill is really the critical skill set. Because at the end of the day, too, there's also the question of understanding your role within the organization. And one of the things that we've seen over the course of the last several months is we've seen some pretty high-profile compliance officers leave organizations after relatively short periods of time. I mean, to the extent that the Wall Street Journal Risk and Compliance wrote an article titled "Mama, Don't Let Your Children Grow Up to Be Compliance Officers." And you've done at the SCCE, you've done a lot of surveys on the stress in the profession and just what a challenging role this can be. What's your piece of advice to a brand new compliance officer, somebody who's new to the space, in terms of how to manage that challenge?
Well, I think it can seem overwhelming, and one of the ways to help make it seem less overwhelming is get with your peers, network with your peers. Go to conferences, and of course the sessions are important, but the breaks and the lunch and the reception and going out to dinner with folks, and try and find out what your life is like relative to others. And the other thing that I would say to them is you've got to be careful that when there's a big issue and you really have to stand your ground, be strong. But on the other hand, if you run up and down the hall with your hair on fire every time there's a little problem, your life is going to be miserable.
Right.
And so you have to have a good balance, and you can get that through networking through your peers. We hold 70 compliance-related conferences around the country each year, and I go to several of them, and it's just amazing how many people help address this issue that you ask about by just networking with their peers.
So perspective, influence, respect the time of your board, and help them understand what a good compliance program looks like.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, Roy, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. I hope you've enjoyed this edition of Inside Compliance, and we'll see you next time.